Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We may have a couple latecomers, but I want to kick off this Advocacy in Motion program on understanding clinical research. Next slide, please. Great, so we would love to thank you for being here today. Thank you to the Autoimmune Association for hosting. We are thrilled to be partnering with the Autoimmune Association. It's advocates and folks like those participating today who really guide our work at Immunovant. We are listening and we learn and we apply those insights. And I'd like to extend a thank you to all of you who have shared your stories and your real life experiences with us. For those of you who may not be familiar with Immunovant, we are a clinical stage immunology company dedicated to enabling normal lives for people with autoimmune diseases. We're developing targeted therapies that are designed to address the complex and variable needs of people living with autoimmune disease. Next slide, please. So the AIM program stands for Advocacy in Motion. It is a skill building program that is designed for US-based patient and professional advocacy organizations. We introduced this program in 2022, and today is our second program, and we're very excited to be here today talking about the importance of clinical research. Next slide. So the AIM program is really built on strong collaborative partnerships, and the Autoimmune Association is our presenting partner for this program today, and we are very grateful for their partnership in this endeavor. The Autoimmune Association plays a leading role in autoimmune disease advocacy, awareness, and research. We greatly value the work that the Autoimmune Association does in support of people living with autoimmune disease. And we aim to really collaborate with the Autoimmune Association in supporting their needs. I'd also like to introduce our partners at CISCRP. CISCRP stands for the Center for Information and Study on Clinical Research Participation. And CISCRP is the leading nonprofit striving to educate and inform patients, professionals, and the public about clinical research. We're very grateful to have CISCRP as a partner on this program, given their role within the community as a trusted partner and as a source of education for advocating for clinical research and educating about clinical research. Next slide, please. So we have 3 learning objectives for today. And the first is to distinguish between the various types of clinical research. The second is to understand the benefits and risks of clinical research participation. And finally, an opportunity to learn how you can better advocate for your involvement in understanding the clinical research process. So I'd like to go ahead and get started with introducing our presenter and our moderator for today. Bridget and Jay are with us. So Bridget is representing CISCRP and serves as one of their advisory board members. She's a clinical research professional with over 2 decades of experience in biomedical research and industry, including roles at the UT Anderson Center, Baylor College of Medicine, and she's currently at Seattle Children's Therapeutics. She's also the founder of a nonprofit, the Hypothesis Haven Science Club, and this is a medical science program for kids that are 6 to 12 that provides early exposure to life science careers and teaches the steps that scientists take to discover, treat, and cure illness. Jay Binman is a 4th-year medical student at UCSF who identifies as non-binary and disabled. Jay is passionate about patient self-advocacy and spends their time in medical school learning about medical management and advocating for patient autonomy. As someone with autoimmune disease and active within the Autoimmune Association, Jay strongly prioritizes self-care, finding community support from other patients, And Jay is studying to become a psychiatrist and researches the healthcare experiences of transgender, non-binary, and gender expansive patients. Jay, Bridget, welcome. We're so glad to have you here today. And with that, I think I can go ahead and turn it over to you, Jay.
Thanks so much, JB. Hi, all. My name is Jay. I'm very excited to be sharing this conversation with you all and with you today, Bridget. Because as a patient myself and a future doctor, I know firsthand that there are real gaps in diagnosis and treatment in many autoimmune conditions. And I think it's super important that patients learn about what clinical trials are, as well as why they should think about getting involved. So many of the questions that I'll be helping pose today are questions that I hear from my friends and colleagues within the autoimmune disease community. And I'm hoping that today, Bridget, you can help us start to make sense of all of this. Are you feeling ready to get started?
Yeah, I'm definitely ready. I'm really glad to be here. One of my really dear friends is also living with an autoimmune disease. So this is a topic that's really near and dear to me. And I'm glad to be here and share any information that I can with the audience.
Great, thanks so much. And so to start us off, can you explain to us what clinical research is? Just starting with the basics. I know there are many different types of clinical trials, and it's important for people who are thinking about clinical trials to understand some of the differences.
Sure. So in the simplest form, clinical research is just the study of health and illnesses in people. So if you've ever taken a medication or if you've ever gotten a vaccine, then you have benefited from clinical research. So clinical trials often try to answer specific health questions. So some of them explore the cause of a disease. Some may look at how behaviors impact a person's health. And then some look at new treatments to find out if there's any effect, if the treatment could work better than something that we already have, or if it's safe for people to use. So these are the clinical trials that I think people are most familiar with. And they test investigational treatments that haven't yet been approved for public use by the FDA. So there are two main categories of clinical research, observational and interventional. The main difference is that observational studies, researchers just observe. They don't experiment or test anything. So in interventional studies, researchers are looking at new ways to treat or prevent disease. So in an observational study, investigators will assess health outcomes in groups of participants according to a research plan, which is also known as a protocol. So a participant may receive an intervention, which can be a drug or a device or a procedure as part of just their regular routine medical care, but they're not assigned to a specific intervention by the study doctor. So for example, an investigator may be observing a group of older adults to learn more about the effects of different lifestyles on cardiac health. But for an interventional study, that's a type of clinical study in which participants are separated into groups that receive one or more interventions so that researchers can actually study and evaluate the effects of those interventions on a health-related outcome. Okay, so the assignments are randomly determined by the study protocol. And so in that case, a participant could either receive a diagnostic, therapeutic, or other type of intervention, which we'll get into more on the next slide. So there are various types of studies, and within observational and interventional categories of research, there are treatment trials, which test a new treatment, new combinations of treatments, or new approaches and procedures. There are prevention trials, which look for better ways to prevent disease in people who have never had it, or ways to prevent disease from returning. There are diagnostic trials, which find better tests or procedures for discovering a particular disease or condition. There are screening trials, which test the best ways to discover certain diseases or health conditions. And there are quality of life trials, which just basically explore ways to improve comfort and quality of life for individuals with like a long-term chronic illness. So depending on what we know and what we don't know about a disease or a health condition, researchers may actually use more than one of these different study types to answer the same research question in different groups of people.
Great. That was such a phenomenal walkthrough, Bridget. And I think many folks in the audience may be familiar with some of those trials that you mentioned those types of clinical trials that are testing new treatments or new approaches to treatment. Wondering if we can dive a little bit deeper into some of the steps associated with those trials. Can you tell us a little bit about how the process works?
Sure. So first, and just kind of to put a context on everything, the clinical trial journey is a long one. It can take many years for a successful treatment to make it all the way from early discovery, which you see on the left, to the approval stage. So their clinical trials are a very critical part of scientific advancement and introducing new therapies for people with disease. They're very carefully designed, they're very carefully reviewed and completed, and before they can even start, they have to be approved by health regulatory agencies like the Food and Drug Administration, which is also known as FDA. So clinical trials are described in phases. Next slide, please. So phase 1 tests an investigational medication on a small group of usually healthy individuals. And right at this stage, we're just judging the safety, we're seeing if there are any side effects, and also trying to find the correct dosage of the medication. So in some cases, people who are living with a specific disease could also be a part of a phase 1 study, but normally it's healthy volunteers. So for phase 2, that involves more people, usually 1 to 300 people. It's continuing to study the safety of the treatment medication. We're also looking at short-term side effects, but also starting to look at early data on whether or not this new medication actually even works in people who have the disease or medical condition. So for phase 3, we're bumping up now to several hundred to several thousand people. And depending on the type of disease and how common it may or may not be, we may be able to reach thousands or maybe limited to hundreds. But these studies actually gather more information about safety and how well a medication might work. So if successful, health regulatory agencies like the FDA will usually review the safety and how well the medication works after phase 3 is complete. So once that drug has been approved or that treatment has been approved and made available to the public, researchers continue to track how the therapy works in real world and its long-term effects. And that's what is sometimes known as phase 4. And so the process that I've just described is the traditional drug development process. But it's important to note that sometimes these steps might look slightly different depending on whether we're talking about genetic treatments or some certain cancer treatments. Next slide, please. So volunteers are critical in the clinical research process. It really can't be overstated how important your participation is if you choose to take part in research. It's very important to note that not every treatment that is studied ends up working the way that researchers want it to. But without people like you who volunteer to take part in studies, we would never be able to discover any new medications for treatments that harm people, or for illnesses that harm people.
Thanks so much, Bridget. It's a really helpful overview of the process and some of the steps involved. And I totally agree with you that volunteers are super important to this process. But I imagine for folks who don't know about what that process is like, it can sound like a pretty big commitment to join one of these trials, especially when there might be some unknowns involved in how efficacious the treatments may be. And so I'm wondering if you can walk us through a little bit more in detail. What are some of the reasons why someone might think about participating in a clinical research trial?
Yeah, those are good points. Yeah. So there are many reasons to participate in a clinical trial. You might want to contribute to the advancement of treatment and care. Some studies are designed to include people who are healthy, and people that might sign up for that study might be someone whose family is affected by a specific disease, or sometimes people, like I said, they just want to take part in a trial so they can contribute to the advancement of scientific knowledge on a disease. You might want to receive specialized medical care, and that's the reason why you decide to take part in a clinical study. So being a participant in a clinical trial is like visiting your doctor for regular care, except you receive more specialized attention. So you're going to be going to the doctor's office more frequently than you probably normally would. Your visits are going to be a lot more comprehensive. And you'll also be you also have more attention from a specialist in the field and their staff than you would if you were going to like your regular PCP or your regular primary care doctor. And then some people participate in clinical trials because none of the standard approved treatments for their health condition are working for them. Or maybe they can't tolerate the side effects from some of the treatments that are currently available. In this case, clinical trials might be the only other option that they have when standard therapy has failed. I mean, I know I started my career as part of a cancer research team, and our office really was a place of last resort for a lot of our patients and their families. So all of these reasons and many others are valid reasons for deciding to take part in a clinical trial. So while we've talked about some of the reasons why you might want to take part in a clinical trial, it is also important to, consider, the risks or, some of the, downsides that might come with taking part. So, the number one thing is that your investigational treatment might not work. We don't know whether it's going to work or not. That is the whole point of, testing it out to see. You might not be assigned to the treatment arm of the study that you're on. Instead, you may get something that is called a placebo, that's also known as a sugar pill, and it basically does not have the active medication that we're studying in it. You might experience side effects on the trial, some of which could be serious. And participating in a trial can be time consuming. That might impact your work or your family life. Especially for people who are dealing with, terminal illnesses, there is, kind of a treatment tax that takes away from the time that you could be spending with your family because you'll be spending that time on getting treatments. And sometimes if you participate in one clinical study, it might prevent you from being able to take part in other studies or even future studies. So these are just some of the risks, certainly not all of them. But these are all definitely things that you should talk over with your healthcare provider and also your study team if you are thinking about taking part in a research study. So next slide. We're moving on to diversity. I feel like that has kind of become a bit of a buzzword in the last couple of years, but pretty much it's a fact that treatments behave differently from one population to another. Okay, and so a clinical trial is only going to tell researchers how something works in the people who actually take part in that study, right? So if a trial does not include diverse participants, we're never going to be able to find out how that treatment would work for all of the people who will eventually be taking that drug. So clinical trials often don't include the groups of participants that are as diverse as the general population. And like I said, we know that those are the people who are going to end up taking the drug. So it only makes sense to want to test that drug out in all of the different people who will eventually be using it. So for example, people who are white are often represented in clinical trials more than people from other racial and ethnic backgrounds. So that's including people who are Asian, Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, or Native American are usually underrepresented in clinical trials for a number of reasons. But having diverse trials helps doctors to learn which treatments are appropriate for people from all different communities. And that just makes it a lot fairer, to reach for healthcare options to reach people who have typically not been able to have them. But even moving beyond race, I really like to point out to people that treatments behave differently in people based on other factors like your gender or your age. I know for any of the parents who are listening, if your 7-year-old has a headache, are you going to reach for, children's aspirin, or are you going to reach for the adult strength? You would reach for the children's. But, if you have an infant or a newborn, there are certain medications that they just can't take at all, if any. And the only reason that we know that these, different things could be harmful for different age people is because there's been careful research that's been done, to really kind of find that information out. Next slide.
Thanks so much, Bridget, for those really important comments on diversity and inclusion within clinical trials, as well as thank you for walking us through the really important considerations when it comes to both the potential risks and the benefits of participating in these trials. So imagining hypothetically, we're thinking about potentially joining a trial. I wanted to raise a question I think a lot of potential trial participants may have, which is, if I were to join, how would I be protected? And so let's talk a little bit about some of the protections that are in place for people who are joining clinical trials.
Sure, and that's really important to point out. So going back to 1974, a document called the Belmont Report was written, and it basically summarizes just the basic ethical principles that were identified by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. So that's quite a mouthful, but basically these principles outlined, the principles that are outlined in the Belmont Report have now been rolled into the federal laws that regulate how humans can participate in research. And so these principles, these three principles are respect for persons, which demands that people who have to enter research voluntarily and with enough information, so they cannot be forced to take part in research, you have to volunteer. Beneficence, which notes that researchers have an obligation to minimize possible harm to research subjects, but also to maximize possible benefits. And then justice, and basically historically, some classes of people, economically disadvantaged, racial and ethnic minorities, prisoners or other people who are confined to institutions, have typically been used, unfortunately, as research subjects just due to their convenience, rather than to their connection to the disease or the illness that's being studied. So today, the principle of justice basically requires that researchers take a very close look at the people who they are bringing into their study. And not only that, but that they're making sure that they're not excluding people from being a part of the study just due to the fact that they might seem to be, somebody who's inconvenient to work with. Maybe they have a limited time schedule. Maybe they're a parent and the researcher thinks they're not gonna, keep up with all the study visits. Like they really have to take a close look, at who is being invited to take part in clinical trials because they actually have the disease or the illness that's being studied. So next slide. If you want to take part in a clinical trial, you're going to be asked to review a document called an informed consent. Okay, but to actually give your consent to participate, which is different than just signing this document, you really need to clearly understand the information about the clinical trial, such as its purpose, its length, possible risks and benefits of participating, and what's going to happen to you as part of the trial. So this also includes things like, what you're going to be asked to do and when, tests and procedures that you're going to have done to you, and then also how your personal data and private data is going to be used. So, I do realize that this, having worked as a study team, that could be an overwhelming moment. You may have just found out that you have, been diagnosed with a serious illness, and then all of a sudden you get this like 20-page, legalese document kind of plunked down in front of you. So, that can be a very overwhelming moment. So what happens if you don't understand something that is being presented to you? Well, it's important to note that it's actually the responsibility of the study doctors and nurses to share all of the information about the trial with you. And not only that, but they are required to give you all of the time that you need to review the document, to make sure you understand the information. And then also they clearly answer all of the questions that you have. So you shouldn't feel rushed, you shouldn't feel confused, and if you do, you have the right to take that time to ask those questions, and they have the responsibility to actually make sure that you're comfortable with all the information being presented to you before you make a decision. So in cases where you might have somebody who legally makes healthcare decisions for you, a person may be able to provide consent on your behalf, or if you're a caregiver, you may be able to provide consent on another's behalf if you have made that legal designation. So this usually happens in cases where someone is too young or too sick, or maybe for some other reason can't really understand the full information of the trial and has put in place somebody to legally take that responsibility for them. So I just wanted to point out again, your participation in a clinical trial is voluntary. Okay, you can choose to stop at any time for any reason, even after you've given consent to be a part of the trial. So there are certain things you need to keep in mind as to maybe, how to do this safely. It's definitely recommended to talk to your study team rather than just kind of going cold turkey and, maybe never coming back again. Because certain medications may kind of have a period where you would just need to be maybe monitored as you come off of that medication. So that's just really important to take into consideration. But you can definitely stop at any time for any reason, or even for no reason at all. That's your right.
Thanks so much, Bridget. Really, really helpful to understand what some of the protections are that are in place for study participants. So the next question is to ask, what else do patients need to know before, or participants need to know before they think about getting involved? And so to go a little bit more into detail, what are all of the things that a potential participant should be thinking about and potentially asking about prior to actually signing that informed consent form?
Sure. And so I like to break this down into things that you should ask about that are going to happen before, during, and after the trial, right? So the decision to participate in a clinical trial is personal, and it should be made in conversation and consultation with your healthcare team. It's definitely important, as I mentioned, to discuss potential benefits, potential risks before you decide to join a trial. But you also need to go a little bit past that. There are so many other topics that you should proactively discuss with your healthcare team to understand how the trial works. So what is the main purpose of the trial? Right? So will I receive the investigational treatment or the placebo? How will the treatment be given? Is it going to be a pill or an injection? I mean, I'm a person who's very scared of needles. So if there's, one part of the study where people are getting injections and one where they're getting like a nasal mist, I might not want to participate if I get put on the arm with the, with the injections. How long will you receive treatment for? Next slide. You also want to think about how long will the treatment last? Will I have to pay for it? Are there reimbursements for trial expenses? Will you be able to see your own doctor? It's also really important to understand your experience during the trial. So, what do we know about the safety of this drug, and what do we know about how well it works? Will you have to stop your current treatment that you're on, even if it's working? And what tests and treatments will you have to undergo as a part of the study? And it's also important, of course, like I mentioned, to think about what happens after the trial ends. So what happens to you if you just decide that you don't want to participate anymore? Will you be able to return to your current treatment after the study ends? If the treatment works, but the study comes to an end, will you still have access to that treatment afterwards? Will you receive follow-up care? And if so, what kind?
Awesome. That was really, really helpful to understand, Bridget. Thank you so much. A lot of really important points that you're raising. I know that every clinical trial is going to be a little bit different, and I'm hoping to just go a little bit more in depth with some of the considerations that you just raised. And so let's go through one at a time and go into each just for a couple of minutes, if that's okay. Great. So this first question is, what if I get in the placebo arm of the clinical trial and I don't end up receiving any treatment?
So this is a really great question, and one that I'm really glad that we brought up, because I think it's one of the things that really kind of gets confused a lot in research and might be a big discouragement for people thinking about taking part. So if you agree to be a part of a research trial, you might receive the trial treatment, so the new treatment that we're testing, or you could receive something else called a placebo. So it's given to you just like the regular medicine, but there's no actual medicine in it. Okay, but you might also get a treatment that is already approved for public use. So neither you nor your study doctor get to choose which one you get. So you can't say, no, I want the new treatment, or you just can't do that, but neither can your doctor, right? So neither of you may know who got the placebo and who got the investigational treatment until the end of the study. But it's really important to state that if you have a condition that needs medical treatment, even if you do not receive the new treatment that is being tested, you will likely be given the standard medical treatment in addition to the placebo. So that's just called standard of care. So all clinical trial plans are reviewed and approved by an ethical committee called an institutional review board. And the IRB will not approve a clinical trial plan that says that participants who are in need of a standard medical treatment that exists can only receive a placebo or a sugar pill. Like, they just will not do that.
Thanks for helping us understand some of the nuances there, Bridget. The next question I have is, what if my condition starts to deteriorate or get worse during the trial?
Yeah, that's a really big thing to consider as well. I know that a lot of times people might go on a trial, just really hoping and wishing that this is going to be the thing that makes the difference. But, that is not always the case. What I will say is that your health is very closely monitored during a clinical trial. And if there is a change in your medical condition while you're on the trial, your study doctor will discuss the situation with you, and they may recommend that you leave the trial. Or they may recommend that you switch to a different treatment.
Got it. And the next question is, if the trial ends, will I still have access to the treatment I may have received?
And so that's also a really common question, and one that's important to talk about. So there are several different considerations to address, and these are conversations that you would have with your study doctor. So these include how your medical care is going to be transitioned after the trial, who's going to be your doctor moving forward after the trial, will you have access to your medical records, will you have access to the study staff, and also, most importantly, will you have access to the study medication after the trial is over. But also, I think something that gets kind of forgotten is just, will you have access to the outcome of the clinical trial? Like, will you get to find out, did it work for a lot of people or did it not work? So getting back to your original question, though, is sponsors, which are the pharmaceutical companies that provide the drugs, they are not necessarily bound to continue providing access to a treatment after a study trial ends. That's a short answer. But, when you're having conversations with your study doctor during the informed consent process and throughout the trial, all of this should be, covered in those conversations. It's definitely important to check and to find out ahead of time. But in some cases, in phase 2 and 3 trials, they have what's called an extension. And basically what that means is, let's say that the study is supposed to last for a year. If it's noticed that people are actually doing really well on the study drug, instead of stopping at that year, they'll open the extension phase of the study. And those people that have benefited will be able to kind of continue on the study for an extra, set period of time. And during that time, the researchers will continue to study the long-term use of the drug and also gather additional information about the safety of the medication and how it's working. And so it's important to notice that pharmaceutical companies and drug sponsors also have programs that will assist families with the extra cost of medications after the clinical trial ends, because when you're on the trial, a lot of the treatments are covered, just by the study itself. But once that trial is over, some companies do have programs that will help with those costs. This kind of depends on whether or not the study is already, whether the study drug is already approved for widespread use. But there are also state-level medication assistance programs that may be useful for products that have not been approved yet. There are sometimes situations where a pharmaceutical company may be able to continue providing that drug after a study is over. But, it really just sort of depends. And these are all the kind of questions that, I really encourage people to have with their study doctor, because, there may even be a period where, let's say you received the placebo or the standard medical treatment during the study, but it did so well on the people who actually received it that you may actually get a chance to come back on what's called an open access arm and actually receive that study drug if that is your choice.
Thanks so much, Bridget, and I appreciate you speaking to cost a little bit when trials are over. And on a related note, the next question I want to ask is, if I'm thinking about joining a trial, how much will it cost me to participate in the trial itself? And is this cost usually covered by insurance?
Yeah, and so the cost varies, but usually most of the costs in a trial are covered by that pharmaceutical company or that sponsor who is providing the study drug. So all of these costs are detailed in the consent form. It explains not only the possible cost of the study, but also some studies will pay you as a participant. So that's included in the consent form, how much you're going to receive and all expenses that will be covered. In addition to, travel costs, Ubers, gas mileage, hotels. And then you would also want to consider the time that you have to take off from work because there is, monetary value attached to that as well. There could also be costs for the care that you receive in a trial. And some of those costs might be covered by your health insurance. But if there are costs that your insurance won't cover, the consent form has to kind of explain what those costs are as well. So, but I did want to point out, you don't need health insurance to take part in the clinical trial. But if you don't have health insurance, you definitely want to make sure to talk to your study doctor and their staff to find out, if there are routine procedures that take place that would normally be billed to somebody's health insurance, how will those be handled on the study? And some trial sponsors actually have programs where they will pay for care that would normally be covered by insurance. So if you have insurance, then, it's just kind of similar to your, paying copays, deductibles, things like that. Insurance plans will cover care in trials that is approved by an IRB. So that's good news. But, and most health insurance cannot, keep you from taking part in a clinical trial, and they can't, limit your benefits because you are taking part in research, right? So, it's really important to just ask your insurance company about that and find out what trial costs they will cover. And especially when you're considering things like what's in network and out of network, you really want to, talk to your insurance provider and, let them know the name of the trial site that you're going to, let them know as much information as you can so that they can really take a look at, and let you know upfront ahead of time as much as possible what is and is not going to be covered.
Thanks so much for those really thorough explanations. I've got one more question for you, and after that, we're going to open it up to a more general Q&A. So audience members, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, in the question box, and we can get to that shortly. So my last question for you, Bridget, is how can we think about finding out more about clinical trial opportunities?
That's a really good question. Let's go to the next slide and we can kind of go into that a little bit more. So there are many resources to keep people informed about clinical trial opportunities. Of course, it's always helpful to speak with your doctor about different treatment options for your condition. Doctors who take part in clinical trials on a regular basis can give their patients access to new treatments or even different uses for approved medications. So I would recommend, to begin your search with your healthcare provider, your physician, nurse practitioner, somebody that you feel comfortable with and that you have a relationship with. But if for some reason they don't have that information, definitely feel free to, seek out specialists in your area. But then also you can go to volunteer health organizations. So think like your Susan G. Komen's, organizations that provide aid and services to people with health conditions often have information about clinical trial opportunities as well. They also may include patient advocacy organizations that have clinical trial information, or even your local hospital or even community support groups for different health conditions could be a good resource. As far as registries and research networks, there are many registries that focus on specific disease conditions, procedures, or medical devices. So once you sign up for the registry, it's basically an organized system that uses an observational study method kind of collect information on you and how you're doing as you progress through life. But they also may have clinical trials information. So for example, the Autoimmune Registry, Autoimmune Research Network, Cancer Genetics, Alzheimer Prevention Registry, all of these are really good resources to find out about clinical research if you're interested in them. And then last but not least is clinicaltrials.gov. So this is a web-based resource, so basically a website that's publicly available. Patients, their family members, healthcare professionals, researchers, all have access. You just go to that website and it basically houses all of the information about public and private supported clinical studies on all kinds of diseases that are taking place at this current moment. So clinicaltrials.gov is maintained by the National Library of Medicine and the NIH, or National Institutes of Health, and it is updated by pharmaceutical sponsors and also the study doctors that run the studies. And so I will say that it's a government website. It's very comprehensive, very all-inclusive. So sometimes it can be, maybe a bit, it's a lot of information. And so that's why I say to kind of, really use clinicaltrials.gov in combination with these other resources that you have so that you can really kind of get a full picture of all of the research studies that are available and are out there.
Thank you so much, Bridget. That was a really tremendous walkthrough of some of the really important considerations in clinical trials. So I want to open it up now to some audience questions that have come in, and I'll pose a couple of these before we wrap up. If there is any lingering questions, please feel free to post them, and if we have time, we'll try to get to as many as we can. So this first question is something I heard you speak on briefly earlier, Bridget, but in case there's anything else you want to share, the question is, can you share more about open label extensions as part of clinical studies?
Sure. So basically, as I mentioned, if you're on a study and let's say that the study, all study protocols are written to very specific plans. So it's going to last 18 months, it's going to last a year, that's all set out in advance. But, we don't know how a study drug is going to work. So if for some reason, we're thinking that, okay, 20% of the people on a study are going to do really well, but all of a sudden researchers are seeing that like 50% of the people on the study are doing well, and we're at the year mark. Well, it wouldn't make sense to just, take people off the drug and then just move along. No, we actually want to find out more data about that. So that's where an extension phase can come in. But then as far as open label, if there have been people, like I mentioned, who have been, on the placebo arm of this study, but everybody who's on the investigational side getting the treatment drug has been just doing so well, we can actually say, hey, the study's over. We've, looked at all of the records and we can tell who received the investigate agent and who didn't. We know that you didn't receive it, but because it did so well in these other people, we'd also like to give you the opportunity to, start taking this drug as well. Because remember, in research, we're really trying to maximize the potential benefits to people as well as minimizing harm. And so that's one of the ways to really kind of maximize the benefit to as many people as can receive them.
That explanation makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Bridget. The next question we have that hasn't been addressed so far, really interesting, is do studies tend to choose participants that are on very few medications? This question says, I am on a ton of prescription. I've always wondered if I even could be in a trial and how they would or could manage that.
That's a really good question. I mean, when you think about it kind of from the pharmaceutical company's perspective, they want to know how well their medicine works. So, it can become a little bit complicated when you are taking other medications that may have similar effects to the medication being studied or may have effects in a negative way. So maybe they interact negatively with the drug that's being tested. So it could be a situation where for your own safety, we wouldn't want you to come on a study and take a medication that we know is bad for your liver, let's say, if you're already taking medication for, your liver. So it's going to compound the effects. But at the same time, we want to find out, if, we give you an Advil, is it going to take away your headache, but you're over here taking Motrin. So it's kind of complicated, but I wouldn't say that just right off the bat, you should, feel like, no, I can't qualify for a study because I'm on medications. Definitely come talk to your provider. Look at the, what's called, it's kind of the rules to be on the study. It's called the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And they really kind of outline, what drugs a person can and cannot be on to take part of this study in order for the researchers to be able to really answer the question of, is this particular drug working in the way that we think that it is? That was a really good question.
Thanks so much, Bridget. It sounds like it's pretty individualized for what a given patient might be taking, but it's worth looking into some of the inclusion criteria that may be published about the study, as well as talking to the folks involved in the study who might be able to get you a little bit more information.
And actually, if I may, I just kind of wanted to add one more thing to that, in
Please.
terms of, really kind of looking at different populations and how they can be involved in research. A lot of the times, let's say if you have a drug for high blood pressure, for example, that you're trying to test, but you know that people who have high blood pressure tend to take a lot of medications. So, it wouldn't make sense to say, or would it make sense to say, we're going to keep people who are taking all these medications already from being on a study to test a new drug for heart disease, but that once this drug gets approved, the general population that's going to be taking the drug is also going to be on all of those diseases. So you would actually have the opportunity to find out what the interplay of all of these drugs is, if you can actually test it in what is closer to a real world environment versus, a world where somebody's only taking one drug who is actually really ill or dealing with a chronic disease.
Thanks so much for those additional thoughts, Bridget. I want to ask another question that is similar to the last question that was asked, but this participant or this audience member says, I've tried several times to join a pruritus trial, which is an itchiness trial. When the question, do you have cirrhosis, comes up, the audience member says that their answer of yes always bugs them because primary biliary cirrhosis is the major reason for their cirrhosis. So, primary biliary cholangitis is the reason for their cirrhosis. And one of the major side effects of that is that it causes itching. So just to kind of echo that, it's a real consideration that some of the side effects that someone may already have or some of the conditions they may have might be directly relevant to the clinical trial. And so you have to wonder, is it a complicating factor that's going to come up, or is it something that they actually want insight on during the trial? And these sticky questions, I think, are a challenge for individual participants to figure out. And so I think it's always helpful to think about reaching out to the folks leading the trial, the doctors involved in it, to see if they can give you specific insight on how your individual conditions may either make you a good person to include in the trial or may prohibit you from joining the trial. Does that line up with your thinking, Bridget?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I mean, because there have been times, in my role as, working on the ethical committee and IRB that we mentioned before, where we really have to look at things like that because, are you saying that somebody can't have cirrhosis because you think that maybe they have a problem with alcohol and maybe they're not going to be a convenient person to be on your study because maybe they're not going to come to the appointments on time, or they not, you really have to kind of look at, is there a true medical reason that is justified for why you're keeping this person off of the study? Or in this case, it sounds as though, itchiness, the cirrhosis, kind of go hand in hand. So if that is part and parcel of a disease that, or a study that is, treating cirrhosis, then, that might be something that you would expect, but maybe the study is only trying to treat itchiness, not related to cirrhosis at all. And, there might be some reason why, taking the drug might be bad for your liver and, cause more damage. So it really is kind of a conversation, definitely, to ask. And I would empower that person who asked that question to really ask your doctor, why? What is the reason? Tell me the scientific reason or the medical reason why it would not be good for me to be a part of this study. I would definitely ask.
Awesome. Thanks so much for getting into the nuances of that, Bridget. Really interesting question and answer. The last question that I'm thinking that we have time for today is the following. One audience member is wondering, is there an entity that rates the quality of a clinical trial or the quality of the organization running it, which I can imagine is really helpful to understand if you're thinking about joining a given clinical trial?
Well, that's a really good question. So the Food and Drug Administration is charged with just kind of like the overall regulating of, any clinic, hospital, individual doctor who wants to run a study. There are publicly available records for people who, researchers, study teams who have broken the rules. It's called 483, so you can Google that and you can find out about a study site. But really, the main way that, so there's not really a rating system like on a 1 to 100, but, there are committees in place and many steps in place because of the bad things that have happened in the past. There's been intentional efforts made, especially with the IRB, that ethical panel. Every single study has to be reviewed by an ethical committee that is looking at how safe is this? How are you choosing the people to be a part of the study? Do you really think there's going to be any benefit? What is the risk? Is the risk to benefit ratio too high on this drug? And the FDA does that kind of review as well. So, I just want people to feel confident that there are multiple layers built in, and that it actually is a lot harder than it's harder now than it's ever been in the past to, either intentionally or unintentionally harm people through research, because there has been such an intentional effort to put multiple different checks and balances in place to keep people safe who are on research.
Thanks so much for those great answers, Bridget. I think we might be getting ready to close out, so I'll have us go to the next slide. I want to first say thank you all so much for coming today, and thank you to our amazing presenter, Bridget. I know a lot of us have questions about joining clinical trials, and I think a lot of really important information came up today. And so I want to close personally by saying that it is so important that we have volunteers out there who are thinking about joining these clinical trials. And if this motivated anyone today to think about learning more about clinical trials or think about getting involved, I think that's just incredible. And we encourage you to keep learning and keep trying to figure out where you can get involved, if anywhere, in the advancement of the knowledge that we have about these really important diseases that we're still learning about. So I'll pass it over now to JB.
So first of all, I want to extend thank you to Bridget and Jay for leading such a great discussion and great program today. And to echo Jason, I hope this enables a lot of the participants to have more robust conversations as they explore whether clinical research opportunities are available and right for them. So along those lines, we do have an additional resource for those of you attending today that summarizes much of the content that was shared in today's webinar. And you will be receiving a follow-up email from CISCRP that will have this handout in there. And you can use this to refer back to it or to guide you through conversations as you explore different clinical research opportunities. I believe we also had a question about whether or not a recording of this webinar will be shared. We will be sharing a recording of the webinar with the Autoimmune Association, and I believe there will be plans to share that webinar through that organization. So next slide, please. In addition to just thanking you for joining today and being part of this conversation, I wanted to let you know that the work that we do for the AIM program is informed by your feedback. So we do have a short survey that you'll receive when you receive the follow-up email that I just mentioned. And it would be greatly appreciated if the participants of today's program would just take a moment or two to give us their feedback so we can actually use that to continue developing content and programs that matter to you. So thank you very much today. Again, a big thank you to our presenter and moderator, Bridget and Jay, and to the Autoimmune Association and CISCRP for their partnership. I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.